Hello and welcome to part 2 of my video with Marlin creator and lead developer Scott Lahteine. Now in part 1 of the video we covered a lot of what's been going in Marlin over the past couple of years. Now in this part we're going to talk about the present of Marlin, we're going to talk about a lot of the features, and then we're going to start talking about what's coming soon, what we can expect in some upcoming versions of Marlin. So if you care about features, if you care about configurations and main boards and displays, stay tuned in this video where we're going to cover all of that kind of information. Now just like last time, if this video is a little too long for you and you want to jump around to the parts that seem the most interesting, check in the description below because I do have the table of contents for this entire video bookmarked for you down below. Now also just like last time, this video is sponsored by GreenGate 3D. Now why did I talk to GreenGate 3D about sponsoring this video? Well, because they are pretty much the only source I use these days for my PETG. It's 100% recycled, made right here in the United States, and it's just high quality PETG that I just don't have to worry about when I'm printing any of my high performance models in this kinds of plastic. It just prints, it's consistent across colors. I just really don't have any problems with it. So GreenGate 3D, absolutely my go-to supplier for PETG. So if you're looking for some of this, if you haven't printed with it before, you're a little scared of it, it's a new material, give a roll a try. You can find the links to buy some of this in the description. Go check them out. They do a fantastic job, and I appreciate them supporting this channel and this video series. So thanks again, GreenGate 3D. Now, on with the interview.
5, 4, 3,
And what's interesting to me is that we're still, you know, while people can point at the power of a board that can run Linux, these days all of these boards are running very similar technology. They're all ARM processors running at various speeds with various features turned on or off. And so that's why we still have so much power, is because it's just a different class of the same processor.
Absolutely. And in effect, you know, there's a lot of processing power that's simply unused on, like, when you build Marlin and running it, like maybe we're using half the power a lot of times.
I mean, and I don't believe Marlin is multi-threaded yet to use multiple core processors either, is it?
Nope, but I watched Gary Explains, and he showed how you can just have multiple init functions and multiple loop functions, or setup and loop. You can have setup and setup one, and loop one, and each of those will run in its own thread. So as far as making Marlin multi-threaded, it turns out to be super easy under Arduino. You know, as long as the target platform already has, you know, all its frameworks are set up to do that, you can do it. And so yeah, we can split off different processes.
I mean, multi-threading is fascinating to me. It's actually been one of my personal hobbies for years and years. I love writing multi-threaded processes because I see so much power there, and that's where PC hardware has gone. All PC hardware has given up on the megahertz race and has gone, well, what if we just throw 32 cores at it and now you can do everything at once?
Nice. Well, I might be consulting you, Chris, then, because
I would love. And in fact, I've thought about, like, as something I could contribute to Marlin, multi-threaded is definitely where my heart lies. I do a lot of that in my own code.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of like which things would be nice to move into their own, like, given a whole processor to, like maybe move all the stepping over or whatever. But there's so much interoperation, like so many variables would be shared, and I was trying to think of which thing we could have which would share the least. And I would think like maybe the UI, move all the LCD stuff to the other. Again, the main thing is just maintaining AVR support has been a bit of a bottleneck, and in certain ways, like, I don't want to give up AVR support, and can we bolt these things in while maintaining that and having it still run under its kind of like naive single loop concept, but then when possible run it as a multi-threaded thing. and yet have these things coexist in the same code base. It's a tricky proposition, but as each thing comes along, we deal with each problem. So it'll sort itself out, I'm sure.
Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
mean, because that's the question, right? Because at some point you decide to either continue down your path, continue supporting all your hardware, or you end up having to fork it and go, well, this is kind of where we have to leave this behind. It doesn't have to die. It can exist as its own thing, but it's not going to have everything because it can't support everything.
Yeah, and I mean, as part of that, there's also this thing called adaptive step smoothing
Yeah,
by Eduardo Tagle, who is in.
and that's been in Marlin for a while now.
Yeah, that has. It's been around and been fixed up and improved as well as recently as April, according to my list here. So that's continuing to get better, and that basically just makes it so that there's as little so-called aliasing as possible as it's doing the motion.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if you're doing a diagonal line, you get less jaggies, basically. Is the idea.
Right.
And that'll run run as fast as it possibly can. Is basically how it goes to get the smoothest stepping that it possibly can. And that basically splits up time into smaller segments. It's basically how that works. So that, like, if you had to wait like this long, you'll now only have to wait this long before checking to see if there's supposed to be a step, and it'll be more accurate to the time it's supposed to be at. Because every step is a little off by whatever, depending on how quickly the interrupt can come back and do its thing. And there's and if you look at our interrupts, like, there's a lot going on in there, a lot of logic, surprisingly, and yet really a lot of it gets skipped. So at any given run, it'll run through this bunch of stuff, but it basically is like.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so
down.
there's a lot of commands, for lack of a better term here, a lot of commands that are being ignored because we don't have time to service them.
Well, more like, it'll be like as you're doing like lots and lots of steps, they'll be as close to when the interrupt comes as it can to put those steps in. And when you're running like on slower machines, it'll even like do 4 steps inside of a single interrupt because it has to. Because if it left and came back, it would take too long to get the steps in. So it runs like 4 steps and then comes back and then exits because it's less calculation or whatever.
Well, then, are you saying that you do skip those sometimes, though? Is there like a timer that says if older than this, let's just leave it alone?
Well, it's more like if you're dividing up. Well, let's say if you go to check your recipe every 5 minutes, you might go and see that it's not burnt, and then you come back 5 minutes later, it's burnt.
Right.
If you would come back 2 minutes later, you might have caught it and it wouldn't be burnt. So that's kind of the idea, is like we check more often whether the step should be done, and like so that the step will be done right now instead of the next time it comes around.
I got you.
So like that's the idea basically.
Okay.
Is like the more often that you check, the more accurate your timing will be from step to step. And so basically the idea of adaptive smoothing is that it just makes sure that steps happen as close to the time that they should as possible. Otherwise, they won't get skipped. They'll just happen that tiny bit later.
Okay, I see.
And what happens is you'll get steps bunching up that as well. So you get like what can happen is you'll get like step, and then like long periods step, and then so what happens instead is you get nice step, nicely laid out. And so it's way better. There's also this thing where trinamic steppers will do square wave stepping, which means that instead of saying toggling the pin high and then low to get a step, you just change it from low to high, and you're done. You exit, come back, change from high to low, and boom, another step. So you don't have to do any of this waiting around for the pulse to be long enough and then set it again. You're done. You exit. And so with that enabled, input shaping again is even more smooth and like accurate and better, because it's like part of the input shaping right now is that it's got a little extra pause in there, and I'm going to actually try and work it out so it doesn't have that. But if you've got smoothing on and you're using square wave stepping and all that, you'll get really almost perfect stepping at that point. So it should be really good.
Let me ask you a question, because anyone that's ever configured Marlin, you have all of these things that you can turn on or off when you're going through configuration.h or configuration_adv.h. And I'm curious, like, as the maintainer, why is it important to you to continue to have these things toggleable as opposed to just enabling things that you think are for the best?
Well, part of it is there's kind of a principle, which is anytime something new gets added that might use more memory or more space, or cause the firmware to get significantly larger, or even a little bit larger, we disable it by default.
Okay.
That way, when you put a build for your old board that only
the AVR problem that we've talked about
you won't suddenly find out that it doesn't fit. Although it does tend to increase slightly every so often because, oh, this would be nice to have this flag, and it would be nice to have this, keep track of that. So a lot of stuff gets added to the default build, mainly just more bytes being used up in RAM, or the size of the build gets slightly bigger. But I'm always anxious to try and keep it from ballooning because I want to continue to support small boards with as long as possible with the latest versions. And then you can, the thing is, of course, as new features become available, it's like you can't just turn all of them on anymore.
Right.
If you have but the thing is, most boards, they've got plenty of space now with 32-bit boards to enable lots and lots of features. And that's pretty cool. So yes, with the new boards, you can definitely have more stuff on. And if you look at the example configurations, like more and more stuff is being turned on in the base example configurations for each machine.
I mean, I know for at this point, there were things, because I think of my legacy with AVR boards, with the 8-bit boards, that I was more conservative of, I don't use this, why do I have it turned on? And I have gotten to the point where, okay, well, it doesn't hurt anything that it's turned on, so I can flip these on. Now it's available to people that want to use those features. I used to turn off things like ARC support because no one was using ARC support. I used to turn off things like volumetric printing because no one's using volumetric printing. But in my latest versions, I start turning these back on because there's nothing detrimental about doing it, and I have plenty of space.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Is it's not like you're going to have, say, with an operating system, you have all these extra daemons running in the background every time you install a new thing. Instead, it's just there, it's available, but it's not actually taking up time or it's not getting in the way. So yeah, why not enable as much as you can? Things like, you may not use it very often, but the Z-probe offset wizard, for example.
I love it. I turn it on.
Yeah, it's just more convenient to figure out your Z-probe offset that way.
I turned the new tramming code, the tramming wizard, which is fantastic as well.
Yeah, and we've even got thing to figure out if you've got a twisty x-axis now. It'll compare and compensate for that. Although you should really fix your twisty x-axis.
Yeah. Some of these compensation things, I'm like, well, that's great, but
yeah, and I mean, in some cases, it's really just your cables are pulling on your carriage, right?
Right.
It gets to this end, and this cable is just pulling just enough to make your probe turn by half a degree or a tiny fraction of a degree, just enough to throw things off, and then your first layer on that side looks bad. So yeah, things like that need to be considered. Of course, we have all these, if you've got the Ender 3 V2, we have all these UIs that we've been making for that. My favorite, of course,
I'm about to start playing more with that because people want it on the Ender 5 Plus, which is one of the DWin based displays, and that has been a big ask, is to support that display without people having to switch over to a TFT35 or something from Big Tree Tech.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm not a big fan of customized displays that have menus that aren't tied into the Marlin menu system. And I agree with you. They don't get everything that's available unless someone makes a special implementation for it. Whereas if you build it around Marlin UI, which I've been trying to encourage, you get everything, and it's just you just have to make it look nice. And I think I did a pretty good job with the Ender 3 V2, both landscape and portrait mode with Marlin UI. So that's what I use.
Well, and I think from our discussions, I mean, that I've been working on this, that I think that Marlin UI will work on DWin displays. Is that correct?
Yes, it's specifically the one on the Ender 3 V2 is pretty excellent. I would like to take full credit for it. I got up to a certain point and got stuck, and then I waited a few weeks, and someone, of course, came along and unstuck us and got us moving.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to trying to get that to work on the Ender 5 Plus if possible.
Yeah, the only trick I want to do is one thing that Marlin UI doesn't have is it doesn't have it doesn't understand that screens can like do their own scrolling, so it just redraws everything as you're scrolling.
It's a performance optimization.
Exactly, it's one of those little tricks we have to add in.
Right.
But yeah, little bits like that will be good to have. But yeah, overall, like the fact that you get everything and it gives you like including your mesh editor and stuff.
That was actually one of the reasons that I had not, like, people have been requesting this for years, and it was one of the reasons I basically just said I don't want to do it, because I'm like, I feel like if I give you something that's halfway there, then you're not getting the full Marlin experience. You're not getting all the features. I'm having to hold back some of the stuff that I can give you because you're stuck on a D-Win display that doesn't have all the UI features. And that was one of the reasons I'd waited so long to support it. And so I'm hoping that with the Marlin UI that maybe now's the time to offer this to people. And so I've finally said let's give it a shot.
Yeah, and the more D-Win displays we can get it supported on, the better. I mean, I also am not a big fan of like the serial ones that come on a lot of printers. And companies like TH3D, they sell a lot of conversion kits to use just regular graphical displays, because these serial displays are just, they don't cut it. They're nice.
Yeah, I agree.
They look cool. They sometimes have cool looking interfaces, and they have and stuff, and they're unique and creative. And it's nice to have the touch sometimes. But now we have touch screens where you can have both Marlin UI and touch.
Right.
Things like the BQBX, of course, has this giant screen. I want to take better advantage of that.
I have mine in a box still. I need to open.
Yeah,
but it's a beautiful display. They make some great screens.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, been meaning to get around to this for a lot of stuff, is like we could have your temperature graph even on the regular graphical display as it's heating up or doing your PID tuning or whatever, and have there are other types of things you could definitely show, and of course, when possible, to show you like your print as it's going to look on the screen where you've got a nice graphical display. And we've got some displays that do that. Of course, there's a simulator, and it simulates the TFT display as well.
Right.
So as far as people developing for those, we can definitely get advanced and quicker development through using the simulator. You don't have to have the machine. You can just tweak and then, boom, deploy it, and then it will work on the real display. So hopefully we'll get much more rapid development as a result of the simulator. And yeah, there's just like, the UI is definitely one of the things I really want to focus on, user experience, and also like first-time setup wizard. That's one of the things, like I talked to Laddie Gok, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who's like with Jellybox / iMade3D, those guys. Mm-hmm. They have like the acrylic printer that's all translucent and stuff.
Okay.
Really beautiful build that's made for kids, so that they can understand all the ins and outs. And they have a really good first-time setup wizard. I've been meaning to get that over to Marlin.
I think that's a great idea, because that's one of the things I think that, like, we try to fix in videos, which is this idea of, how do I set up my printer? Do I need to do these things, or should it be ready to go out of the box? And it's somewhat of a moving target if you do it in a video, because it means probably every year we have to make a new video, because the process has been tweaked or improved or just something's different. And so you keep having to return to that, and then your old video is now old news.
Yep, and even your Prusa MK machines have the setup wizard for first-time setup as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot to choose from if we wanted to port them over or take the existing ones that are already there. Our trouble, of course, is what if it's a Delta or a Core XY? We may have to change some things for each of those, tailor it. But just having the something where it's a flag. Did I do first-time setup? Yes. No? Okay, we'll show that.
Well, and it even gets more complicated, because what features do you have enabled? Like, is the tramming wizard first-time setup? Well, it depends on if you had the tramming wizard enabled. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and another way to approach it would be to just have like a first-time setup screen that is kind of like the universal bed leveling, where it has 1, 2, 3 each step, and you're supposed to go through each step. And it doesn't automatically go to the next step necessarily, but it just sets you up to say, okay, now you'll go to the next step. And, building more of those kinds of things, more like modal dialogues, and just kind of like making it more of a user experience that's familiar and more in the idiom of what people people are used to from different devices or the desktop or whatever. And, just making it, because initially when it was put together, it was very ragtag, I would say. We need menus. Okay, well, let's make the menu, and little by little pieces have been bolted on. We need a select screen. We need, a thing that asks you a question and all this. And so as these things have been built, they've been kind of bolted in, with an eye towards making them extensible for other screens and stuff. But we can definitely always improve on that.
So we've touched on something else here. We've got more that has been improved on in the past couple of years. The display, the user interface. This is all something that has been a focus of Marlin, making it more usable, making it, I guess, fit into more niches and support more hardware. Because what we're talking about right now is the idea of the displays, not only the main boards.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is as displays get smarter and stuff, it's we just have to be ready. And some of these things even have been I remember there's one, I think it's MakerBase, one of their displays tries to handle your filament runout on the display within the display code, which is in Marlin. But yeah, there's and there's kind of these different paradigms, so we have to adapt to each one.
Even Big Tree Tech has that on their Touch UI. You have to decide where to plug your filament runout to. Do you want it to be operated by Marlin, or do you want the touchscreen to do it?
Yeah, and one way or another, it's going to come back. Well, I guess it depends, but yeah, it's supposed to come back to Marlin, but they might be sending custom G codes, say a serial display or something.
Right.
But just an M600 should do the trick, and then the display should respond to the messages that it has going back and forth. And we have this host support, working closely with Octoprint and stuff to make better interoperability with if Marlin needs to ask the user for some input, it can put up a prompt in Octoprint and you can say, oh, yes or no there, instead of having to go to your LCD or type a G code like M108 or whatever it is that says yes or no or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, having that kind of interoperability has also been important. Being able to pause an SD print from the host or pause a host print from the LCD, for example.
Right. Yeah, and I've seen all of that added, and it's made the Big Tree Tech displays way better because now they just respond better. They can handle more of that interaction. There's a lot more communication that is now possible from the Touch UIs back to Marlin.
Right, and that's a word I really want to get out is right now with Marlin 2.11, it's probably the most bug-free and stable version of Marlin and the best overall that we've had. And anyone upgrading from a prior version, it won't necessarily be much bigger. It shouldn't be too hard to move over the settings from older versions. And in general, and we have lots of examples now. So if you're moving over from a standard configuration, it's very easy to just build and use the auto build to just hit the right build button and you'll be good to go. And just trying to make it easier for people to upgrade. If you upgrade Marlin, you really do get a better machine out of it. Especially if you haven't upgraded in a lot of years, you'll be going from something which probably has bugs that occasionally pop up and prints that occasionally fail and maybe even poor performance in some cases, to a machine that's much more fast and smooth and just overall more polished. It's really been we're talking about, I don't know, it's been about 3 years or 4 years or something since we really got out and talked about these things.
Right.
Because of the bloody situation. And it's been, it's a great opportunity. Earthwood, for example, is a great opportunity to get up and sort of share that stuff. Although I wasn't feeling up to doing a talk. I wanted it to be more fun and less pressure. So I was if I have to do a talk, I'll be spending all week on it. I won't get as much done. I just won't have more to show when I get there. But this is a good opportunity talking to you to share some of this stuff and get it out there. There's just so much that's been improved. And if you just compare config versions from one to the next, you can see all the things that have changed and been added over time. Or look at the release notes. And if anything in there looks interesting to you, now is a great time to upgrade. Really.
Yeah, and I went, the last version I had made for the Ender 5 Plus firmwares that I maintain was 1.93. And now I've gone to 2.11. I did find that the the process of moving between 193 and 211 actually had less pain points than in the past, which was probably not even intentional. It just worked out that way. The patch sets that I built for myself were just applied, and were overall things just built really well. The interoperability of all of the features and turning things on didn't really cause any problems as I moved from platform to platform or board to board.
That's cool. I mean, one of the things I've tried to do is with this sanity check file that's there, is like you could take your previous configuration and just drop it in Marlin, change the version bit at the top to the right version number, and then just try and build it. And what happens is sanity check will say, oh, this option changed from this to this, and you just change it. Or this option changed from this to that, and you just change it.
And that's a lot of work on your side that I've always been impressed that you do that, because I know that sanity check is a separate step that you have to do to go in. You have to write a little bit of code that tells people that things have changed. And that's an extra step you go through to try to help move people forward.
Yeah, and I initially thought maybe it would become part of like the automation configuration tool, and maybe it still could, where it'll look at that and say, oh, well, yeah, if I'm doing a migration, I can just look at the sanity check, and it has, you know, in some form, the information about how to do the migration. So I could kind of glean from that. I mean, clearly, I'm thinking about it, I'd probably have to do a database or something along those lines to really do it properly, to have like migration from any arbitrary version to the other arbitrary version. But it's all there.
The micro stepping forward is way easier than the big leaps.
Yeah. So since building that is going to be all a bunch of hassle, it's like, well, the least we could do is at least tell the user what to do, and it's generally a good guide. It's like, it's a mystery. Like if you just go to build something, usually what happens is if it's like an old config and there wasn't a sanity check, it would just go and try to build it, and you get all these errors in the code, and it would be a big mess. Right. But with the sanity check, and also there's another file called warnings that only runs nicely. It's a CPP file, so it only builds once, rather than spit out warnings for every bloody file.
Right.
And like sanity check will like actually stop the build, whereas warnings will just give you warnings and just tell you, oh, you need to do this, or you built it and maybe you should enable an LCD, or you should enable this other feature because there's no way for the user to give you feedback or whatever. So it gives you warnings about things that you might want to change. And then all that stuff makes the build easier. There's also, we've done this amazing work of optimization. Because we use VS Code and Platform IO, it's built around a system where it can actually we actually have a little script that looks at the config and says, oh, well, these options aren't even enabled, so don't even go and build those files. And it filters out like every file that depends on a feature is initially.
And that hasn't always been there, I don't believe, right? That's a relatively new feature.
No, I was just like, because like kind of like spitballing off the top of my head one day in one of the discussion groups, and I was like, I wonder if we could do this. And then someone was like, yeah, we could. And so it just started to get built out, and little by little we collaborated and built it out bit by bit. There's all this other thing related to that where I made a thing where as part of that, it'll look and see if you have a file called config.ini, and it'll apply anything that's in this config.ini file to your configuration before it does the build.
Okay.
And so it can do things like it could download a configuration from somewhere else. That's one of the options in this ini file. And then replace your configs with that and back them up to another folder.
Okay.
So, and then
I think there are so many features like that people don't even know exist in Marlin. Like, unless you've asked about it, or unless you've looked for it, or you've heard it whispered, you don't even know that that's there.
Well, that was there in part in consideration of people who are building like tools online, for example, to do Marlin builds. It's like maybe they'd like to have a way to make it scriptable where they don't necessarily have to do the hard part of modifying the config files. They can just put stuff into this ini format, and it'll just get that'll get run through our script that'll take that and do the modification of the config files for you. Previously, you had to have we have these commands which are available as part of our scripting suite, and for developers, one is opt enable, opt set, opt disable, and we use them for our tests. And those are just little shell commands that turn on one or more options or set one or more options to values. And but you have to run each one at a time in a little script.
Sure.
And it was like, That's fine, but wouldn't it be nice if we had an INI file that just described what you want to change? And so, and the other thing I want to have is, I'm also doing is we have this, it'll take your config and spit it out as a schema in a big old thing. And then it'll take your config and save it in a zip file and stick it in the firmware itself, so that if that was there, you could take your binary and run a certain command, which is actually M503 like something, and it'll spit out that file onto your SD card as a zip file. And you take the unzip that file, and that's basically the configuration that was used to build Marlin. And so there is a way to get the configuration used to build Marlin out of Marlin, but the vendor or the person who created the binary has to actually put it in there, or else, you know, and it'll show up inside of the capabilities report in M115 as well, if that's there. So
is there a similar, something I've wondered, is there a similar command, and I'm sure I could look this up, but is there a similar command where, how can I save my settings to a file rather than just outputting them to the console?
No, actually, but like
if I want to do an M503 that prints it to the SD card rather than me having to cut and paste it out of the console.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be a possibility. It would basically work very similar to the way that it does like the dump of, I think it's called MC for Marlin config.zip. MC.zip, I think, is what ends up on your SD card. So yeah, I could spit out the M503 stuff, and that would be your current settings, which is cool. Yeah. Rather than, it wouldn't necessarily be your configuration settings, it would just be whatever you have set now.
Yeah, and that's, because that's what I end up doing when I go from one version to another. I end up dumping my M503 and then putting it back in the new one because, you know, EEPROMs need to be reset due to configuration changes.
Yeah, that's cool. And I mean, I tried to set it up that way. Initially, M503, back in the olden days, would just spit out like, this setting is this and that setting is that, and it would spit out text and maybe some G-codes. But I really, really wanted like your M503 to be something you could replay.
Okay, good, because that's exactly what I do with it.
And it would reproduce your config exactly as it was, or at least your settings, whatever you last had them as. And if you want, you know, your defaults, you do M502 and then M503.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And then you're good.
Yep. And that's what I suggest to people all the time. I'm like, this is going to reset your EEPROM. If you want to save your old settings, make sure you M503 them. But to my point, if we had a M503 whatever that wrote it to the SD card, it would save them a step to then have an M503 load from SD. Right. And I think that would be helpful moving forward.
Just run it. You could just go to your SD and run it right away, and call it like restore.gcode or something like that, with an underscore on the front or something.
So there's you something to do when you're bored.
And that along those lines, I'm also, you know, the auto build Marlin plugin for VS Code. I've got new features coming for that. One of which is that configuration editor I briefly showed you. Mm-hmm. The idea there is you open a config file, and instead of a bunch of text, you have a form, and with a filter at the top, so you can type in the word probe, and it'll only show you the options that pertain to your probe.
Right.
And when you click a checkbox, it hides the options that you don't need to see because they're not pertinent because that thing's disabled, and all that kind of stuff. Just make it easier to find stuff, and you know, and if you're just looking through and you just open it and want to scan it, it's still scannable, and all the comments are there and all the documentation is there. It's just in a form that's easier to kind of scroll through. It's all done. The cool thing about the VS Code is you just build stuff in HTML and JavaScript, and so if you're a web dev or whatever, you know that stuff, you can just build interfaces all day long. The tricky part is just synchronizing everything as you open, close different panes and show multiple views of the same file and stuff. It gets fancy. So I'm kind of stuck on the last 5% and of all that kind of thing, and just getting it. You know, the easy part was spitting out a big old form. The hard part is getting it all to interoperate nicely and always work and stuff. But, you know, that's par for the course, right? Hopefully that'll be, well, I'm going to release probably an experimental version of that, at least, you know, preliminary version in one of the upcoming Auto Build Marlin releases. So,
okay.
And, you know, when you open up VS Code, Marlin and VS Code the first time, it does tell you if you don't have the plugin that you should install Auto Build, dude. That was one of the other little things I threw in there, just so it'll nag you if you don't know. Because people weren't. It wasn't exactly super discoverable that we had this auto build thing. And I've even seen people that go and they'll download auto build. I've seen people do this on YouTube. They'll use it. They'll have it installed, but then they'll never open up the auto build panel.
They just thought it was necessary to compile Marlin, but they didn't know how it works or what it does.
I guess I'm going to have to turn on the show panel checkbox by default, because right now I think it might be, but yeah. So at least it'll be discoverable. And the cool thing about that is even if you have like your platform I default environment set up to point to exactly the one you want to use to build with, like if that happens to change or if there's multiple ones, AutoBuild will show you all the environments you can build with. So maybe you want native USB, or maybe you want ST-Link or something like that support for debugging. You can do that build instead, and it'll just be there. The tool, ultimately what I want is I do want to have like migration, so you can more easily migrate from an older to a newer version. I want to have nicer interfaces for some of the config options, like when you're doing your bed size and your probe offsets and stuff. I want a graphic that shows here's your bed, here's where the center is, here's where you've set your home position. So it's really, really clear. And all those settings are like easily, you can see this pertains to this, and as you change it, the bed gets bigger or the probe offset changes, and have everything be shown graphically. I was going to maybe hit up Billy for that kind of thing, Billy Rubens, because she's very talented in terms of graphic design, but she's very busy right now working for Lightburn or somebody. So we'll let her have her job and work for them. I can do graphics. I'm fine. But yeah, making all that stuff nicer, and just making again the build experience simpler. Among other things, like I've been adding, like when it shows the names of the pins file that goes with your thing, you can now click on it to open it, and things like that. So which it'll basically, I have another little sidebar that I have available to like put stuff in. I'm like, that would be a good place for more of these things, like list all the statistics about what you're building and then have links to all the relevant bits, so you can find the pins file that is your pins file for this build that you're using, and it'll just open it right up, or whatever else is pertinent. Open up your click and open up your config if it's inconvenient to do so. Otherwise, I mean, it's right there in the list, but
right.
You might find it more convenient because it's right in the interface to click that. But yeah, just make things like that more accessible and make things more easy to find, get around. And then also like links to help and relevant things as well should be there. Like when an error message comes up, maybe it would be nice to occasionally link to the page that gives a better description, or the troubleshooting page or something, just anything that helps the user along. There's also like Arduino IDE 2.0 just came out, so I'm interested in seeing what can be done in that to optimize things. There is some back end to it that's kind of hidden, and so I don't know much about it. But apparently there is some utilities there. So right now when you build with Arduino, of course it builds every file in Marlin, and so it's much, much slower.
Do you still support building with Arduino IDE?
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I haven't done it that way in a while, so I didn't know.
Yeah, well, I don't blame you. It's much slower because I think it's also well, I don't think it's using a single-threaded like compiler or anything like that, but it definitely is slower because it's building everything. Right. And I know in the older version of Arduino IDE, the compiler wasn't super fast, and it's kind of like even when you build TNC with Platform IO, like the compilers that are distributed with those are single-threaded, and so they're much slower.
Right. Yes.
So certain platforms like STM32 build really fast. Build with TNC, it's really slow. But the results are ultimately the same. You get a nice optimized build, and we do filter out again. We still filter out as much as we can. But if I could filter out more sources in Arduino, that would be really awesome, because that would make the build go much more quickly. Typically now I do a build, and if it's been built once, it's like 10 seconds, 5 seconds. I mean, it's really fast on modern hardware. I'm using an M1 Mac, and it's fast. I also have tried building on a Raspberry Pi 400, and boy, that's like go make some coffee.
All right, so we've talked about all the improvements you've made. We've talked about all the improvements that coming, at least in terms of the input shaper. What do you have, at least short term, that is maybe already in the works? You've already seen it as like, change requests that have come in. What short term can we look forward to in Marlin?
Well, short term, let's see. In this next upcoming release, there'll be.
You said, just for the record, that's 2.12 should be the next one.
2.12. Yeah, 2.12.
This isn't. We don't have a full 2.2 yet.
No, well, I'd have to change the names of more branches if I do that. And that's that's a
More
hassle.
work.
So yeah, we're just gonna have to find excuses not to call it 2.2.
Okay.
General, a lot of general tweaks, fix-ups, more reliable stuff. There's actually an issue with if you had like 8 or more axes, you might have had an issue. So that should be fixed up now.
Hasn't been a problem here so far.
Yeah. So that's going to be fixed up. That was just a little variable conflict thing. There's just a lot more polish and fixes. 2.12 again was emphasis here was bug fixes mainly, and just continuing to polish and basically anything that was submitted for new hardware support, new boards, whatever we got. We always have a few more with every release.
Right.
Of course, input shaping will be in there as an experimental feature for people to try out. In the short term, my aim is basically just to continue to, let's see, there's a few things that I definitely want to work on at kind of like a technical level, like in terms of just setting up Marlin to be more prepared for the future. And again, modernization of the code base and stuff like that. So for developers, that's more relevant than for users. I'm hoping to see get more partnership with some of these vendors who put out boards and things to help them get the updated versions of Marlin to their users as typical thing. A lot of devices you buy, the vendor will say, hey, there's a firmware upgrade you should download and use. A lot of these vendors don't do that. They simply put out the firmware for the machine. And
oh, sure, yeah. I see that from a lot of printing companies. The first version, unless there's a major bug that someone finds, they never put out another version of Marlin for that printer.
Yeah. I mean, I would love if they
which makes jobs for people like me.
Yeah, and it makes you feel like they've almost abandoned the product in a certain way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because they should
be.
Well,
because they'll keep producing the printer for years.
Yeah.
But never upgrade the firmware, even though the printer is produced. I mean, the Ender 5 Plus is a perfect example. That one shipped on 1.16. It is still shipping on 1.16.
Yeah, and there's no reason for that. They really should take advantage of the fact. I mean, I understand there's a certain certification, we tested it, all works, we made sure it passed all our tests, blah, here we go. But there's so many, passing the test is one thing, but I mean, you don't necessarily know that it's fixed up certain things that you never tried to test, or makes things more better. Absolutely, it is more better, no doubt, and all that kind of thing. So I really want to see more of that. And I don't know if I can reach out through these channels or whatever, but it's hard to get that to happen. Just you can't just nag people. So
it's resources on their end, and they don't feel like that's a. I'm assuming that they just continue to feel like that isn't anything that adds revenue to their stream by upgrading the Marlin on the printer.
And I mean, we have some go-betweens, and we have and we can kind of, in some ways, even through things like the Facebook support groups, we can get into some of the folks who can be helpful in that regard. I think, even though they may not be on the marketing side, I feel again, it's sort of an element of marketing if you make people like you for putting out better versions of the firmware for the machine to make it.
No, that is good marketing. It's they're still this printer's been out for 3 years. They continue to support us, that kind of thing. I mean, we were talking earlier about the CR6. That's another good example of a printer that the community ended up having to take over the support of.
Yeah.
Because, and I don't know personally what Creality is doing with the CR6 these days, but there was definitely enough demand where the community says, we can do this better, we can keep this updated, we can provide a better user experience than what Creality was doing.
And that's the thing. I mean, whenever I see something that's called a community firmware, it gives me a bit of a sinking feeling. I know it sounds like such a positive, happy thing. Hey, the community got together, but it gives me that sinking feeling because it's like, why did they have to do that? On the
Right.
one hand, why isn't it? And why aren't they? Why isn't it being just contributed to upstream Marlin? And why does there have to be this other fork over here? I understand it's a focus on a certain machine, but then it becomes divergent a little
Well,
bit.
and in my
Harder
case,
to
my
incorporate.
community firmware for the Ender 5, Ender 5 Plus isn't
Yeah,
code changes. It's just configuration. It's just providing that
right.
latest set of settings for that specific machine. I'm not
Yeah,
making upstream changes to Marlin. I'm giving
yeah,
the people the latest.
yeah. My hope is just that we have the same config at least in our
Yeah,
examples, so that when people download our examples, they get something that's close to or equivalent to the community firmware.
I
So in the
agree.
case of the CR6 SE, it's one of the ones I've just had trouble integrating because I'm lame. Yeah, I hope to see more of that in the future. So that's a hope anyway, if not a plan. As far as plans, yeah, I mean, working more closely again with Prusha is definitely one of the plans. Bringing more of what they've been working on into the upstream Marlin and vice versa,
hmm
because we're working independently on various things, and there's definitely some overlap there. Certainly with things like input shaping, I'm sure they've been working on that in their spare time, and looking at the problem within their own firmwares for like the mini and stuff. So working more closely with them will be good. And catching up on machines that we have neglected is definitely one of the things. Get at least the configurations for them.
Right.
TAS6, for example, and others.
And that's still
And
in that separate repo that's being maintained. I think.
configurations, I call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I take care of that as well. It requires a lot of searching and replacing to maintain the. I think there's over 300 and something, 350 configurations in there or something. It's really a huge
Well,
number.
and I wondered how you do that because, like I said, that's basically what I do from Ender 5 version to Ender 5 version is port the configuration forward. But I'm not content with just making sure it still compiles. I actually want to bring in the feature set as well to the
Yeah,
configurations, and I don't know how hard or how easy that is for you to maintain. Not only just compatibility from release to release, but also making sure that they get the new features.
yeah, and that's what these baby steps of like doing the config INI thing was kind of for. It's like I can take a config that actually have a little script that I was running, and I was like, take every config, download them, generate a config INI for every single one, and then I would have those, and then if I want to, I could take that, get some, run some thing and run it backwards. Have each of those config INIs generate a whole new set of
Right.
proper, full configurations. Whereas actually, it turns out if you could have an empty config file and a config INI, it would work fine because it'll just fill up the empty file
Sure.
with whatever's in the INI. So yeah, you could build it just with the INI if you wanted to. But the idea being, yeah, like anytime we needed to generate a new blob of configs, we could just use this source or even stick it all in a database and generate configs out of for any version we need to. And also at the same time have like the whole relational thing where you can compare more easily between things because you've got a bloody database.
hmm
And like all those kinds of things are nice, and I'd love to get more of that together. That's kind of a big deal. That's so much clerical work, and it's like I have to steal time for that in between other things, and I'm sort of building the pieces, and kind of hoping it'll start to build out and come together. But choosing what database to stick it into and how to manage all that, what kind of interface to build around it, has been tricky, and there have been discussions about that over on Discord. I mean, we're always working on various ideas in Discord to kind of get these things together and start to wrangle because there is just so much to manage, and it's like it can definitely be daunting. So sort of getting that more organized, putting out, making it easier to migrate again and things like that are definitely in the future. And overall, like my hope is to keep Marlin just pushing forward and getting better and better features like input shaping and maybe better versions of input shaping so that you can push your speeds higher and get better quality results and make better value out of the machines you already have, and also kind of give vendors fewer excuses to go to Raspberry Pi plus another board where that might be overkill. I mean, I think a lot of it is the user experience of the Clipper is great because you'll get a web interface with it, although there's a web interface with Marlin if you got the SP32 board already, but it's not to the degree that the polish that has been put into some of the interfaces around Clipper, which look a lot like the Octoprint interface and stuff. But just paired with and also, Octoprint and Marlin have always been a really great pair together. And there may be some way in which Octoprint plus Clipper plus, can be a thing. But I feel like Octoprint is much more kind of in the same family and open source ethos as Marlin is, and kind of this grassroots kind of community, like very well established kind of long-standing community project that's just been really well put together.
Any other long-term, maybe like dream ideas or things that just aren't like, these aren't short-term solutions, but anything long-term for Marlin that you've thought about, have been on the books for a long time that you just haven't had time because it's going to take up too much of your energy, that kind of thing that's been floating around?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, a lot of my stuff is kind of on the level of, I want to, like, for example, the way that Marlin deals with its EEPROM settings right now is kind of like, it's fine, it works, but it's not organized in such a way that it makes it modular as much, I'm
assuming at this point, and I don't know because I haven't looked at the code, I'm assuming it's pretty much memory region. Here, let me write my settings to that memory region so that I can read that memory region back. Is pretty
well. Everything's named, so it's sort of like.
I mean, is there like a lookup table you can do individual lookups and?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of moving parts to any time you want to put a feature in Marlin. There's like, if you can imagine, you'll maybe have some file that's devoted to the class built around your feature. So you got to do that. Then you might have to put something in the main loop. Then you might have to put something into the setup for it. Then you might have to add some call or handler code in some obscure place in the temperature code. And then you might have to add something to the settings file to do that. And so it's like any given thing has all these parts that are scattered around. And it would be really nice if it was possible to have like what you would call a module. You just drop a folder in, and then you say, oh, does that file or folder exist? And let's build it and include it, and then it'll be sort of hooked in. But doing that, of course, it ends up being, anytime you try to make things more modular, they tend to balloon in size.
Right.
And make things, you attempt to make things more flexible. There's always more things that are variable. But I have wanted to like just start out with like something very simple, like the way that the EEPROM works is anytime you want to add something new to the EEPROM, first you have to add the structure that tracks where it should be, if it's there, so that it can be verified. And that's just there to verify. That's the whole reason you do that. And then you add the code down below to read it, write it, reset it, and then do any post-processing after it's been read or reset. So there's like, all those pieces have to be in there. And it's like, it would be nice if for a given feature, the EEPROM just goes, hey, feature, what should I be reading? What should I be writing? What should I be resetting? And it should have calls that are each of those. So it's like standardized APIs, you could call it, around that.
And that's what I figured. The EEPROM is more of a read once, write once, not really a random access kind of feature.
Right, exactly. And things are always...
But that has to do with the way that Marlin runs as well. I mean, as we've talked about, Marlin's one giant loop. And so there's not a whole lot of need for it to go and randomly access the EEPROM at some point during operation.
Yeah, no, in fact, it never does. It just reads and writes to it when you tell it to.
Right,
and,
exactly.
Once in a while you'll have an interface which is set up so that when you change this option, it'll automatically write to EEPROM. I kind of opted to have it like it doesn't write to EEPROM unless you explicitly tell it to for the standard interface. But, just because I was worried that you'd wear out your EEPROM. But apparently they're very hard to wear out.
That's what I've heard.
It takes a lot, and someone did some testing on that to see how many millions of writes it would take, and it's a lot. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be too worried. So now I'm thinking, well, we should just, anytime something is changed, maybe we should just save it to EEPROM so that the user, you get what you expect. You reboot, and there it is. It's what you just had. Rather than reboot and then, oh, that setting I just changed is lost because I forgot to save it to EEPROM.
Right. Yes. I mean, particularly when you're talking about things like meshes, which take time to run, and then people often forget to rerun them or save them to your EEPROM, and so now you've lost something. And I mean, I've done that. I think we've probably all done that at some point where we went, crap, it crashed, crap, the power went out, and now you have to redo the configuration.
It's true, and the EEPROM is optimized in the sense that it checks to see if what it's about to write is already there, and then if it's already there, it doesn't write it. Which means if you only change one setting, then it only has to write that one thing, which is maybe one cell in the EEPROM. 1 byte, and I guess in order to change 1 byte, you do have to change the whole cell or whatever.
Yes.
But it's the way that it works. But yeah, so it's nice that if you didn't change something, nothing will happen. It won't write to it. So it'd be nice to have that kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to be able to do was be like, well, what if I just want to reset this one thing without everything else being reset? It'd be nice to have that as a thing, as part of any given feature or module. It has its own EEPROM handling, therefore you can just reset that one thing to its defaults, leave the rest as they were, rather than always having to reset everything to its defaults. So things like that would be nice, and moving in that general vein. Also, a lot of our LCD code is just repeated stuff because it was all contributed from a different, very similar. A lot of them are DWin LCDs and things like that. So I'd like to just squish those down and come up with more commonalities and get it more standardized. And just wrangle it, get more control over the code base, and then there's this whole aspect of the code base, which is that it's built around being statically built, and things like you can't change your pins once they've been set. They're variabilizing a lot of that stuff would be something to kind of approach, where you could say, I want to change the pins I'm using because, I don't know, whatever, this heater broke on my, this MOSFET burned on my board. I want to switch to a different one, but I don't want to reflash the firmware.
I mean, going back to Clipper, I think that's one of the strengths that people really like about Clippers is you don't recompile Clipper when you change a setting. At the most, you have to reboot Clipper. Right. But those settings are all, everything's there. Now we just read from this file and reconfigure.
Right, and Clipper being on a Raspberry Pi, if you imagine, their code base is built around this idea of you build it statically, and you guys to make more things variable, such as being able to change pins. And then, we're also discussing how, if you have everything hosted on the Raspberry Pi, then you could just drop the source code in a folder, and it would rebuild the parts that need to be rebuilt into binaries. And then, so for something like Clipper, it could happen transparently. It could even be doing stuff like checking the server on the internet and downloading the latest version. Oh yeah,
I mean, the fact that you're running on a full-feature operating system like Linux gives you a lot more power, and we know that. I mean, as software developers, the fact that it's a full-featured OS, you can do things like load libraries and unload libraries, and have the full suite of Linux libraries available to you in terms of multi-threading and interprocess communication. There's a lot more available to you because the operating system provides that. You don't have to write it from scratch.
Yeah, I mean, you could, frankly, you could do all kinds of real cool tricks with that. Obviously, you could have, a UI and run some Scratch program that's controlling the printer, something like that, for kids, and pick up the nozzle, put down the nozzle, move here, move there.
So that does it for part 2. I hope you've enjoyed this part of the interview, and I have one more part to go. And in that part, it's pretty much all Clipper. We're going to be talking about Clipper, how Marlin relates to Clipper, how the Clipper community relates to Marlin. There's a lot in that next part of the interview. It's about the same length as this one, so if you want to know what's going on with Clipper in relation to just what Scott and I think about it and what our interaction has been with Clipper, I think that you will really enjoy the next part. So be sure, subscribe to this channel, like this video. You'll get notified if you hit the little bell when you subscribe as soon as I post that video. So one more time, thanks to GreenGate 3D for sponsoring this video. See these things back here? These are all GreenGate 3D printed parts, and they are holding up beautifully. So I like to use PETG for all of this kind of functional printing. It's just a great solid material. So again, if you haven't tried out PETG, you want to give it a shot, check out the link in the description to order you some GreenGate 3D filament. Again, thank you to Scott for doing these interviews with me. We had a blast, and I will see you all in the next part where we wrap all of this up. Again, thanks for watching. I'm Chris, and this has been Kersey Fabrications, and I will see you in the next video.